A cold dawn mist slowly creeps over the grey surface of the Thames, shrouding the outlines of Westminster's towers and the heavy silhouettes of merchant ships. In this pre-dawn hour, when the city is still deep in heavy slumber, the river begins its eternal mystery. The water rapidly recedes, exposing the slimy, inky black bottom, which for centuries served as a giant treasury and simultaneously as the sewage canal of the world's greatest empire. A small figure in soaked rags, barely 8 years old, carefully takes its first step into the viscous, cold mud. Every breath here is filled with the sharp, suffocating smell of decay, old iron, and filth. But the child doesn't notice it. Its gaze is fixed on the murky sludge underfoot, where, amidst broken glass and animal bones, a coveted piece of copper or a fragment of an old salt-soaked rope might suddenly gleam. This brief moment between high and low tide is the only opportunity to snatch a chance at existence from the river, the boundary between a hungry evening and the hope of a dry crust of bread. Here, in the shadow of majestic bridges, a drama unfolds where treasure is what the rest of the world considered useless rubbish. 19th-century London was a boiling cauldron where the gold of the colonies mixed with coal dust and the despair of the slums. The city grew at an incredible pace, becoming the center of world trade, but its true underbelly was revealed precisely here, on the shoreline. The river was the main transport artery, along which thousands of vessels moved around the clock, from huge tea clippers to squat coal barges. In the process of this frantic activity, an incredible amount of objects fell into the water. Sailors dropped coins and personal belongings. Porters accidentally broke the fastenings of crates of goods, and city services used the Thames as a natural way to dispose of all waste. For hundreds of years, the river accepted everything: meat shop waste, construction debris, ash from fireplaces, and the contents of cesspools. All of this settled at the bottom, was ground by powerful tidal currents, and carefully laid in layers in deep, dense mud, deprived of oxygen access, which created unique conditions for the preservation of even the most fragile materials. For most wealthy Londoners, the riverbanks were an exclusion zone, a source of infection and stench, a place to be avoided at all costs. However, for the most deprived part of the population, the riverbed became the only available workplace that required neither education, nor tools, nor membership in professional guilds. Those who engaged in this trade were called Mudlarks. This name sounded almost poetic, if one did not know the harsh reality hidden behind it. Most of them were orphan children, or offspring of extremely poor families living in the labyrinths of the East End. Their working schedule was not dictated by the clocks on cathedral towers. It depended entirely on the lunar cycle. As soon as the water began to recede from the banks, hundreds of small shadows rushed down the slippery staircases of the embankments to inspect every inch of the exposed mud before the river returned and reclaimed its gifts. The lives of these gatherers were a succession of endless trials, where physical endurance clashed with the whims of nature. The typical equipment of a mudlark was primitive to the extreme. They had no rubber boots, no gloves, not even warm clothes. Most worked barefoot, despite the riverbed being literally strewn with sharp flint shards, broken pottery, and rusty iron fragments. Any scratch in this aggressive environment could lead to severe consequences, as the Thames water at that time was a complex chemical cocktail of organic waste and industrial effluent from tanneries. However, the fear of infection always receded before the fear of hunger. A child with a wicker basket or an old tin can tied to their waist would spend hours stooping, sifting silt through their fingers, becoming a living search tool. The The social status of these people was the lowest in the urban hierarchy of Victorian London. Even street sweepers, who cleared roads of horse manure, or rag pickers looked down upon the Mudlarks. These children were the ghosts of the city, beings whose skin gradually acquired an earthy hue and whose clothes became indistinguishable from the river silt. Researchers of that time described them as people who had lost their human appearance but retained an incredible will to live. They were the invisible sanitarians of the city, extracting tons of scrap metal and coal from the river, thereby unintentionally cleaning the riverbed. However, the law viewed them with suspicion. The line between collecting discarded items and petty theft from moored barges was extremely thin, and the police often chased the children from the bank, depriving them of their meager earnings, which, on a good day, amounted to only a few pence. The external conflict of this trade lay in the constant struggle of man against relentless urbanization. London was rapidly encasing its banks in granite embankments, building huge docks and bridges. These engineering structures changed the nature of the current, making it more unpredictable. Mudlarks found themselves caught in a vice between the growing power of the industrial giant and the natural elements of the river. New jetties narrowed the search area, and huge steamboats maneuvering in the narrow channel created powerful waves that could suddenly engulf an unwary gatherer. The river was a treacherous employer. Getting carried away searching for a valuable item in a remote part of the bank, one might not notice the tide cutting off the path to a saving ladder. The water returned swiftly, and a person stuck in deep mud found themselves in a trap from which it was almost impossible to escape alone. The inner world of these small seekers was filled with a paradoxical mixture of fatalism and excitement. For a 10-year-old child, each trip to the river became a dangerous adventure, where physical well-being was at stake. Over time, they developed incredible intuition and sharpness of vision. An experienced mudlark could determine what was hidden below, a useless bone or a piece of coal, by the color of the bubbles rising from beneath the layer of mud. They knew the habits of the river better than any geography professor. It was a life of constant tension, where every found item was instantly analyzed for its market value. A nail from the sheathing of an old ship, a piece of copper dropped by a sailor, or even a handful of spilled coal. Everything had its price in the junk shops. In their minds, the world was divided not into beautiful and ugly, but into saleable and useless. The personal stories of these children rarely made it into newspapers, remaining only in the reports of charitable organizations. But behind each of them lay a fate full of early maturation and loss of illusions. They saw the underside of the great capital, its rot and refuse, literally passing them through their hands. This shaped a special character, tough, cynical, and incredibly adapted to extreme conditions. They had no games in the usual sense. Their childhood was spent studying the composition of river silt and fighting for the right to occupy the best section of the bank. This was the tragedy of an entire generation that found itself superfluous in an era of great geographical discoveries and technical triumph, forced, in the literal sense, to survive on the debris of someone else's prosperity. On an ideological level, the existence of mudlarks exposed a profound contradiction in Victorian philosophy. This was an era that extolled progress, order, and Christian virtues. Yet, at the very heart of this civilization, thousands of people lived a lifestyle not much different from primitive foraging. The paradox was that British society, which was building railways all over the world, could not ensure the basic safety of its own children. The conflict between an impersonal system aimed at maximum profit and the living human being who became a byproduct of this system reached its peak here. Mudlarks were a living reproach to an empire that had learned to conquer oceans but could not cope with poverty on its own shores. The philosophy of this trade was based on the eternal cycle of matter. What was a casual loss for a rich merchant became salvation for the poor. The river acted as a great equalizer, stripping some of their valuables and returning them to others in the form of scrap. This was a hidden economy of waste, where nothing went to waste. The gatherers were intermediaries in this process, transferring forgotten and discarded items from a state of non-existence back into economic circulation. This demonstrated the wisdom of survival. When resources are scarce, even the most insignificant fragment of the past can become the key to tomorrow. The river was both a graveyard of things and a bank that issued its loans to the most patient and brave. The transformation of this phenomenon began in the second half of the 19th century. London faced the consequences of its rapid growth in the form of a terrifying sanitary crisis. Thousands of tons of waste, dumped daily into the river, led to an event in the hot summer of 1858 that went down in history as the Great Stink. The smell from the Thames became so unbearable that the work of Parliament was practically paralyzed. This became a turning point. The government was forced to allocate colossal funds for the creation of a modern sewage system. Under the leadership of engineer Joseph Bazalgette, enormous treatment facilities and new granite embankments were built, which forever changed the appearance of the banks. For mudlarks, this meant losing access to many traditional foraging sites. But at the same time, the river became cleaner, and the nature of the finds began to change. With the introduction of compulsory education laws and restrictions on child labor, the number of young collectors on the banks steadily decreased. The state began to realize that the future of the country depended not on how much coal a child collected in the mud, but on their ability to read and write. The trade, out of necessity, slowly gave way to other forms of activity. However, the banks of the Thames did not become empty. The place of hungry children was gradually taken by adult men, for whom searching in the silt became either a temporary refuge during periods of unemployment or a strange, fanatical hobby. By the beginning of the 20th century, the attitude towards finds began to acquire a new nuance. People started to notice that among the rubbish, there were items that had not only material, but also historical value. A moment arrived when a chance find could overturn the understanding of an entire region's history. In the mud, ancient coins from the Roman presence, medieval pilgrim badges thrown into the water in hopes of divine patronage, old smoking pipes, and Tudor-era jewelry were found. What was once perceived as scrap now began to attract the attention of collectors and antiquarians. Mudlarking started to transform from a means of survival into a form of understanding the past. Researchers realized that the Thames is the world's largest open-air archaeological archive, where layers of silt have reliably preserved the daily life of Londoners for 2,000 years. The culmination of this long history occurred in the second half of the 20th century, when modern technologies became available to seekers. The invention of compact metal detectors completely changed the rules of the game on the banks. Now, one no longer had to rely solely on sharp eyesight or accidental luck. The devices allowed peering deep beneath the layer of mud, discovering metal objects that had been hidden for centuries. The trade definitively transitioned from a social problem category to a regulated hobby category. The administration of the Port of London introduced a licensing system, transforming spontaneous searching into an ordered activity. Modern larks are often highly educated individuals who treat the river and its mysteries with deep respect. Today's treasure hunters on the Thames are voluntary assistants to archaeologists. Each of their finds is recorded in special registers, and the most valuable artifacts are transferred to the collections of the Museum of London. What was once agonizing labor for survival has become a fascinating process of restoring historical memory. A button from a soldier's uniform from the Napoleonic Wars, a tiny lead toy lost by a child centuries ago, or a ring with a half-erased inscription. All these connect us to the past with invisible threads. Now, searching in the mud is not an escape from hunger, but a desire to touch living history, which is not locked in display cases, but lies directly underfoot in the cool sand of the embankment. The resonance of this topic in the modern world is enormous and multifaceted. The history of mudlarks serves as a powerful reminder of the incredible resilience of the human spirit. We see how people are capable of finding opportunities where others see only dirt and hopelessness. The lesson the river teaches us is that the value of any object or phenomenon is deeply subjective and depends on the context of time. The trash of one era becomes invaluable testimony for another. This makes us reflect on what trace we ourselves leave and what future generations will be able to learn about our time by exploring our own cultural layers. The modern fascination with mudlarking, as this process is now called in the English manner, is a kind of therapy for people of the digital age. In a world where everything is becoming virtual, the search for real, tangible objects from the past provides a sense of stability and continuity. It's a return to elementary human curiosity and respect for the labor of those who lived before us. We understand that the history of a great city was created not only by monarchs, but also by millions of nameless people whose possessions were swallowed by the river. Through these objects, we hear the voices of those very children who shivered from the cold on the bank a century and a half ago. Their involuntary service to history has preserved for us the material memory of the past, making them part of the great narrative of humanity. Gazing at the panorama of modern London, where mirrored skyscrapers reflect in the waters of the Thames, it's impossible not to feel this connection of times. When the water recedes again, exposing the dark, slimy bank, figures of people reappear on it. They are still bent over the mud, still carefully examining every inch of the exposed land. Now they have waterproof boots and sensitive detectors, but they are driven by the same feeling as the little vagabonds of the 19th century. The eternal expectation of a miracle. The hope of finding something special amidst the mundane. This is the desire to find meaning in chaos, value in oblivion. The Thames continues to be a great guardian, carefully sheltering in its silt the evidence of countless human lives. The mudlarks of the past have long completed their earthly journey, but their spirit lives on in everyone who descends to the water today. We realize that behind the brilliance of any civilization always lies its shadow side, and it is precisely there that the most important and sincere truths are often hidden. The river is a mirror of our history, reflecting both the grandeur of achievements and the bitterness of losses. Concluding this immersion into the history of the banks, we return again to that very child at dawn. His small hand, reddened by the icy water, clenches a rusty copper nail. For him, it's just a guarantee that today he will be able to survive another day. He doesn't suspect that decades later his struggle for existence will become the subject of scientific works and inspire thousands of people to search for their roots. He simply does what he must, and in this simple act of survival lies the greatest mystery: humanity's ability to transform trials into experience and oblivion into memory. The river flows, the tide invariably replaces the ebb, and each new cycle brings new discoveries, reminding us that nothing disappears without a trace, as long as there are those who are willing to seek and remember.